Ariana has taken the survival of, I think. Right. I would probably agree. That's the essence of the country. So if I can show ways that Washington is working or is not working for those people, that should be what I should be measured against every day.
Okay, now this morning details are out on the much anticipated new book by journalist Bob Woodward. It offers a rare behind-the-scenes look at what's been going on in the Obama administration.
It's amazing, and some of the things that are coming out about this book is about the decision to increase troops in Afghanistan, and there was apparently some concern over that and some strife over that. In the book, Obama Wars, Woodward says infighting has consumed Obama's national security team. For example, Vice President Biden reportedly called Richard Holbrooke, quote, the most egotistical bastard I've ever met. Secretary Gates allegedly warned that Tom Donilon would be, quote, a disaster if promoted to be National Security Advisor from his current position as deputy. And General Petraeus is said to believe that White House Senior Advisor David Axelrod is, quote, a complete spin doctor. In addition, the book discloses that according to U.S. intelligence reports, Afghan President Hamid Karzai was diagnosed as a manic depressive. U.S. Ambassador Carl Eikenberry talks about Karzai in the book, saying, quote, he's on his meds, he's off his meds. That's actually been reported. According to secret meeting notes and documents cited in the book, President Obama repeatedly pressed top military advisors for a way out of Afghanistan last year. When they only offered options that required adding significantly more troops, the president crafted his own strategy that called for 30,000 troops in a short-term escalation. Now, that Bob Woodward, of course, will be a guest on Morning Joe next Wednesday and be talking a lot more about the book. I'd love to hear what Michele has to say about this.
We've all seen this before. Bob Woodward plus war plus new administration equals chaos contained in the book.
And the chaos is not completely surprising. I mean, given the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not surprising that there's kind of political intrigue. And, you know, we can focus on that, but it's deeply troubling when you think about this, because there's no clear way out. And whether he followed one strategy or whether he followed another strategy, it's clear that we could be in Afghanistan for a very long time. And what is most troubling to people who have sons and daughters who are over there, who are thinking about what this means for the country, for the economy, is that there's no clear path. To whom do they pass the baton? The only way out is to be able to leave the country into some sort of stable hands, and the government that can actually handle it.
That doesn't
get a manic depressant who one day wants to be a member of the Taliban and the next day wants it is a complete mess, an absolute mess.
At the same time, you wouldn't be surprised then that they are fighting over it.
But at the same time, if you look at it from the perspective of the troops who are sent into that country to die and risk their lives, to me this book and the contents of it are so embarrassing and so humiliating for us as a country that we would send our soldiers and we would send them into harm's way for a unclear objective at this point, and then have a book come out that has the presidential advisors that are advocating these soldiers risk their lives with, excuse my language, a bitch fest that's in a book about who should and who shouldn't, and that is what is the most troubling to me.
People who are pushing the strategy saying it's not going to work. And we've seen that here. Michele, let's
know what working is, right?
Well, they don't know what
is working.
They don't know what victory is.
This happened after the Vietnam War. There are a series of books that, put a sharp microscope on the White House and the Pentagon, and we learned quite a bit about that. But 10, 20 years after the fact. I mean, right now in the sort of the real-time journalism we conduct, and the sort of confessional nature of this country that people, it's sort of surprising. I mean, Woodward's very good at what he does, but what's surprising is that people are talking about these wars as they're still conducted.
As they're going on. I know. Let's talk about The Grace of Silence. It didn't end up being the book you thought it would be when you started. Explain.
It's an accidental memoir. I decided to try to write a book about the hidden conversation on race in this country because I thought something interesting was happening in the run-up to the 2008 presidential campaign and in the wake of President Obama's election. And I thought I would be writing a book about other people. Along the way, I learned some profound secrets in listening to the hidden conversation in my own family. I discovered that as a young man, my father had been shot. Shortly after he returned from World War II, he returned to Birmingham, Alabama at a time that black veterans had fought for the country They had fought for democracy overseas, and they wanted a taste of it back home. They wanted to vote. They wanted to participate in civic life, and they met a white wall of resistance. And in my father's case, he was going to an event. He was, a police officer tried to stop him. A scuffle ensued, and he was shot. He was shot in the leg. I also learned secrets on my mother's side of the family. They never told us these things. They never told us these things because they didn't want our path forward to be cluttered by their frustrations. And at first I thought that that would be an anecdote in this book about the discussion about race that other people were having, and I just needed to know more about my own family, and so I decided to pivot and write this book that would examine the world that they lived in, what happened to them, how it impacted me, and to learn a little bit more about this country. And in this sort of period preceding the civil rights movement, I mean, in the book I explained that it's like Harriet Tubman ran up to Martin Luther King and passed him a baton, and we sort of skipped over, you know, the 40s and the 50s.
That's not what happened.
No, it's not what happened. We talk about civil rights, we talk about the, you know, the mid to late 1960s.
Michele, are you glad that your parents kept those stories from you when they did?
Or do you understand why?
I understand why.
Are you glad they, do you think if they had told you that, that may have affected your growth?
I do. I mean, I wrestled with this. I wrestled with this a lot. This was a deeply painful book to research. It was a deeply painful book to write. It is a hard book to talk about. I will never get used to saying my father was shot. Those words never will fall easily off my tongue. But I understand why he didn't talk about it. Because, you know, when you send your children out into the world, if you really want them to soar, if you want them to go out and conquer the world and do great things, you don't put boulders in their pocket when they leave the house. You know, you don't share your own tales of personal frustration, and that's why they kept it.
How's it changed your view of America? The view that you had
and what you were researching
as a kid, as a teenager.
You know, people talk about race and anger are always intertwined. You know, people are angry about race, or either they're intimidated.
How do you not get angry if your father was shot because he was trying to have the same rights as white Americans?
But at the same time, what I look back and I see is it's easy to get angry. It would have been easy for him to be angry, and basically for a generation of veterans. I mean, one of the things I learned in the book is that this was not aberrational. Black veterans, when they returned, we don't really know this. We don't talk about this. Dozens of black veterans were beaten, maimed, burned, castrated, blinded. I mean, it was a blinding of a black veteran in South Carolina that ultimately prompted Harry Truman, President Truman, to integrate the military because he was so incensed by that action. That was blinded 3 hours after he was honorably discharged in South Carolina. We don't know these things. But instead of looking back in anger, I look back in wonder. Because as a country, we managed in a very short period of time to move from that to the things that we see today.
How did your father not give in to hate, though?
You know, part of it may have been a natural temperament. I mean, he was a guy with a pretty sunny opposition. He just was. I know that, you know, from talking to people about the child he was, the teenager he was, the person he was. And some of that was by temperament, but I think a lot of it was by choice. And I talked to a lot of these veterans who were marginalized in the military and marginalized when they returned home. And they made a choice to move forward, not with anger, but with hope. And that's why I look back and wonder, because it would have been so easy for them to make another choice. And when we think about race as being something that sparks people's anger, I think we forget that instead of taking their frustrations out on the world, that there's a large group of people, a lot of them, and you know these men, you know, they tried to show the world what they could be in the way they comported themselves and the way that they handled themselves at work and the way they kept their homes, their gardens were perfect. I know you know who I'm talking about. And they tried to send a signal to the world, and they moved forward, and I think in some way, by deciding to arm their kids with ambitions and trying to show America what it could be, they sort of shoved the country forward. They like put a shoulder ahead and said, let's move ahead.
Howard, I forget sometimes because I was in Mississippi. My dad worked for Lockheed. I went to a public school in first grade in Mississippi in 1969. First year it was integrated. I think it was 50-50 African American and white. So it was all very natural to me. Okay, Barack Obama got elected, great. That's a guy I went to elementary school with, I went to law school with. But I forget sometimes, talking about the 40s and 50s, that when I talk to friends like Jim Clyburn,
Oh, yeah.
Jim lived in this time. For me, you might as well talk about Harriet Tubman, because that was before I was born. But isn't it amazing that there's so many guys like Jim Clyburn who have to have that same disposition?
Well, I think Michele is telling a story about another aspect of the greatest generation. I mean, we talk about the greatest generation. These World War II guys and women, but they are heroic in many, many, many ways. And the African American experience that she's talking about is another aspect of their stoicism, really. I mean, they were giving the country. I mean, he wanted to help his family, but it was also a positive act for the country to say that I've served, and now I'm going to continue serving by keeping my stories to myself so my children are free. I mean, it's a very inspiring thing. This is a great generation of people of all colors.
What I tried to do in the book is also understand people who lived on the other side of the color line. I mean, my mother, who never talked about any of this, now likes, when they were the first black family that moved in the south side of Minneapolis, every neighbor whose property line touched ours moved. My mother, it'd be easy for her to be angry, and she now lives in a condominium where they're, white women, black women, most of her friends are women who probably would not have befriended her, in the 1950s. And it's important to think about people who lived on the other side of the color line, because I went and I found people in the South, people in Birmingham, and some of the things that I heard in the course of this were very troubling. And if we want to have this so-called honest conversation about race, the people who at one point enforced segregation and enjoyed segregation have to be part of that discussion also. And it might not be easy if you were on the other side.
Michele, stay with us. And the grace and silence, truly get a sense now.
Dylan,
incredible.
Dylan,
10 seconds.
Tell us about our
this is a great idea.
Seconds about what you're doing at this job.
I want to express, there's something that has occurred to me. I talked, Michael Eisner was on the show yesterday, books called Working Together. I'm talking to a string of folks for weeks now about exactly this, and I think what your story represents is the concept of just us. There is not us and them. You're not allowed to make decisions in the context of us and them, because that World War II generation had to be us, because that was the only way forward.
Right.
And I think that part of what we've lost recently and in the intermediate period between the stories you're telling and today is us, and instead we've gone to us and them.
Right.
And I thank you for sharing and being a privilege to listen.
Dylan, thank you.
And that's what he's going to be talking about, his job war
We'll
show.
be watching Dylan's special.
I'm sorry, exceeded your time.
I did.
But
Can you do it here? Can we see it?
Good for
Look
you.
at that.
Be the
Look at that.
Job wars. Keep that up. Nothing but job wars.
Right here on MSNBC.
Oh, it's the
Boy,
same
you're
lettering.
folding your arms like that?
Yeah.
You must be powerful.
I am.
Still ahead, best-selling author
Yes.
Deepak Chopra will be here. Plus, why Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's trip to the UN General Assembly may be adding fuel to a very hot fire. You're watching Morning Joe, brewed by Starbucks.